Welcome back to today's video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at a head-to-head Joe Biden versus Donald Trump election prediction for the 2024 election based off of polling data. Let's get right into today's video. Alright, welcome back to LT Elections 2024. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this head-to-head matchup between the former and current president, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Let's go ahead and start by filling out some of the safe states for either of the respective candidates. So some of the safe states here along the eastern and western coasts here, Plains region will go extensively Republican here, along with several states here in this region. On the eastern and western coast, we obviously know that on these extremities, we see here that President Biden and Democrats generally end up doing very well in these particular states. Now, many individuals have been saying recently that other states like Illinois and California could be competitive. I tend to disagree with those viewpoints. I think that they will be closer. All that being said, I think that Joe Biden will handily win those particular states by smaller margins than he won in the 2020 election. The state of Utah, with its heavy Mormon population, will go to Donald Trump, along with several of the congressional districts within the state of Nebraska, excluding one of the congressional districts in the state of Nebraska. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some other states here. We'll skip the state of Indiana, where former Vice President Mike Pence was his governor in, and also the state of Iowa as being safe for Donald Trump, a state which voted to make abortion restrictions in that particular state. And then we'll also give the state of Ohio as being likely. Now, the reason why Ohio is going to be likely and Iowa is going to be safe is because of the fact that Iowa is actually a state which voted to make abortion restrictions, whereas Ohio voted by a pretty large margin to not make abortion restrictions in that particular state. In the state of South Carolina, it will go to Donald Trump. He got an endorsement from Senator Tim Scott in that particular state, and it will go to Donald Trump. For our next state here, the state of Texas will vote likely for Donald Trump, and the state of Florida will vote likely for Donald Trump. The two big states there for the Republican Party, with 40 and 30 electoral votes, a combined total of 70 electoral votes, will vote for the former president. Texas is a state which has been experiencing some immigration problems, which may cause it to vote for the former president, and the state of Florida obviously becoming much more conservative since the 2020 election. Moving on here, we're obviously going to go ahead and give President Biden the state of New York by a safe margin, and we'll go ahead and give President Biden several of the congressional districts in the state of Maine, two of the congressional districts amounting up to 3 electoral votes. We'll also give President Biden the state of Illinois by a safe margin, and then we'll also go ahead and leave the rest of the map blank for now, and we're going to come back to these particular states after looking at some polls. So let's take a look here at some polls here with regards to where the candidates stand here in these particular states. And again, this prediction will be made based off of polling data, strictly based off of polling data. Whichever candidate leads in a particular poll, that poll which shows the candidate leading will be given to that particular candidate with regards to the states. So to begin with here, Joe Biden's approval rating right now, obviously at 39.1%. We have been tracking Joe Biden's approval rating using the 538 generator, and we do see that his approval rating has been about the same for quite some time. It has been around 39% for the past 2 months or so, and his disapproval rating approximately the same, 55%. Now, on the contrary, Donald Trump's approval rating here, taking a look at 538, is also not looking too good whatsoever. This was actually on Donald Trump's last day in office. So on Donald Trump's last day in office, Donald Trump's approval rating was not so good. But that's not really what I want to look at. When you go back to this point in Donald Trump's presidency, you go back January 28th. Let's go back to January 28th. Okay, so January 30th, like January 30th. We see here that Donald Trump's approval rating was 42%, 42.8% at this point in Donald Trump's presidency, and his disapproval rating was 52.8%. That's approximately 43%. Now, what is Joe Biden's approval rating at this point in Joe Biden's presidency? Well, Joe Biden's approval rating is 39.1%. Now, that's approximately a 3.5% difference. So Donald Trump's approval rating at this time was 3.5% higher than Joe Biden. Okay, so we'll keep that in mind there. Now let's take a look here at a head-to-head Biden versus Trump matchup in the general election according to 538. We see here that according to 538, Donald Trump does continue to seem to be leading. We see he seems to be leading in a majority of these polls by relatively big margins. We do see here that when one of these polls here in the state of Pennsylvania, Joe Biden actually ends up leading, which is actually interesting because of the fact that Pennsylvania could be a state which Joe Biden actually ends up keeping in the 2024 election due to the fact that he does seem to be doing relatively good in some of the polling data in the particular state of Pennsylvania. And obviously, if he does end up winning the state of Pennsylvania, it could make Joe Biden's path for the 2024 election much easier, considering the fact that Pennsylvania has a large number of electoral votes. But we'll take a look at more polls into the state of Pennsylvania as we continue. But let's take a look here at some general election polling data. So in the general election polling data, again, we used 538. This is Real Clear Politic. Now, in Real Clear Politic, we do see a continuing theme, and that is that the former President Donald Trump does seem to be leading current President Joe Biden by relatively good margins there, about 1 to 5 points. Now let's take a look here at where former Vice President Biden was at this point in the 2020 election. So at this day in history, in the 2020 election, we see at this day in 2020, January 28th, 2020, we see here that Biden was actually leading Donald Trump in the majority of the polls. Although today, just 4 years later, we see the exact inverse, the exact opposite. We see here that former President Trump does seem to be leading President Biden. That being said, then former Vice President Biden was actually leading then President Trump by actually larger margins. Then former Trump is leading President Biden. Currently, you see here that in a majority of these polls, former President Trump is actually leading Biden by around about 5 points, 3 points. Although in a majority of these polls, you see here that former Vice President Biden was leading by 4, 10, 8 points, 7 points by larger margins in the 2020 election. Now, at this point, 8 years ago in the 2016 election, we can see here that Hillary Clinton was actually also leading Donald Trump at this point. And Hillary Clinton did not actually end up winning the presidency. We can see that then former Secretary Clinton was leading then businessman Donald Trump by around 2, 3, 4 points here at the time there. Oh, you do see here that Trump was leading by 3 points in some polls. Although what do we see here, a common resounding theme, is that in these polls in 2016, Trump overperformed the polls in the general election. He didn't overperform general election polls, I should give them that. Although that being said, we did see here that when Trump was behind, he ended up winning, right? When Trump was behind, he ended up losing by a smaller margin, okay? At least in the particular states, okay? Although now Trump's ahead. So what this could mean is that this is not very good news for Joe Biden. Now, in the general election polls, they were correct. Okay, so I'll give the general election polls some credit. Joe Biden ended up winning the election by around 4.5% in the general election. Okay, now in the individual states, it was a little bit shaky for Joe Biden. But in the general election, the polls were okay. In 2016, polls were also okay. Hillary Clinton ended up winning by 2%. It's a little bit less than the polls projected, but around 2% in a majority of the polls. Now Donald Trump is leading by 4 points, 5 points, 1 point, 6 points. It's not looking too good for Joe Biden in that particular respect. So that is the general election polling and tracking it down. Now let's take a look at a head-to-head Trump versus Biden matchup in the state of Michigan. So in the state of Michigan, when you average the polls, you see here that Trump's leading Biden by around 5.3% in the state of Michigan, which is a swing state, okay? So the state of Michigan, a swing state, Trump's leading by around 5.3%. Okay, in the state of Georgia, Trump's leading by almost around 6.6%. Trump's leading. In the state of Nevada, Trump's leading by almost 9%. In the state of Pennsylvania, now this is Joe Biden's hope. Again, I told this to you guys. Joe Biden's hope is winning in Pennsylvania because here's the thing. He's doing very good in the polls in the state of Pennsylvania. So taking a look at this here, Biden's leading Trump by a small margin, I will say though, 0.6% in the state of Pennsylvania. Now that is a relatively small margin, although it's still a lead. Okay, it's still a lead for Joe Biden. And again, this video is going to be made strictly off of polling data, so I do want to preface that that Joe Biden is leading by 0.6%. Now let's move on to the state of Wisconsin. So the state of Wisconsin, Trump and Biden are tied. Trump and Biden are tied. So we'll obviously have to infer some stuff from that. And then in the state of Nevada, we already looked at this, but here's another look at this. We see here again, Trump is leading Biden by a smaller margin than he was in the other poll, but is still leading. In the state of Arizona, Trump's leading around 4 to 5 points, 2 points in some polls. Now in the state of Virginia, Biden's leading. He did win the state in the last election. I do expect him to win the state again. He is winning, leading Trump by a relatively good margin there. And then in the state of Minnesota, we see here that Biden's leading by not that big of a margin, only 2.5%, yet it is still a lead for President Biden. Now let's go ahead and take a look here at our electoral map here. Let's go ahead and start from the west to the east coast. We'll go ahead and give, based off of polling data, former President Trump, the state of Nevada. Also in the state of Arizona, based off of polling data, former President Trump is leading. And then moving on here to the state of Minnesota, we see here that President Biden is actually leading. So we'll give him that state by a tilt margin. Now, in the state of Wisconsin, if you go back to the Wisconsin polls, okay, we see here that Trump and Biden are tied. So I'm going to go back to that poll, talk about it a little bit in a few minutes here. But we'll skip that state for now, and then we'll go to the next state, the state of Michigan. Trump seems to be leading in that particular state. We just looked at polls there, and we see here that Trump was leading. So he's going to win the 15 electoral votes in that particular state. In the state of Georgia, Trump's also leading. He's going to win the particular electoral votes there. Now let's move on here to the state of North Carolina. We're going to go ahead and give it to former President Trump. In the state of Virginia, we're going to go ahead and give it to President Biden. So President Biden will win in that particular state. Now in the state of Pennsylvania. So in the state of Pennsylvania, this is going to be interesting. I'm going to go ahead and give it to former President Biden, current President Biden rather, because of the fact that he was able to win in the polls at least. He was able to win. Let me pull up that poll here. So he was able to win by 0.6%, a small margin, but again, we are basing this entire video based off of the polls. Again, you could say that, oh, the polls are wrong, the polls are correct. Again, you are able to make that decision for yourself. This video is strictly based off of polls. So now in the state of Nebraska, for the state of Nebraska, let's go ahead and give this particular district to Joe Biden by a tilt margin. Now, I'm not so sure that Joe Biden's actually leading in this particular district. I haven't really checked. All that being said, Joe Biden won in this particular district by a 6-point margin. It's heavily anti-Trump, so I'm going to give it to him. And then there was some redistricting that took place in the state of Maine, one of the congressional districts, although I still will give it to former President Trump. He did win by pretty good margins in both 2016 and 2020 there. So we'll go ahead and give him that particular district. Now, here we have former President Trump leading Biden by about 13 electoral votes over the magic number 270, 13 electoral votes over that. Now let's take a look here at the state of Wisconsin. So the state of Wisconsin, let's take a look at the poll here. We see here that President Biden is tied with former President Trump. They're 45.8%. So 45.8%. Now, that being said, when you go back to the 2020 election polling data, we saw that President Biden actually was leading former President Trump by a very, very big margin in the lead up to the 2020 election. And polling data in that state particularly, actually overestimated President Biden's lead at the time, then former Vice President Joe Biden, in the lead up to the 2020 election. Now, what actually ended up happening is that Joe Biden ended up winning in the state of Wisconsin by an extremely small 0.6% margin, even though he was ahead by extremely large margins based off of polling data. Now we see that they're tied. So what I'm going to assume at this point is that the polls are underestimating former President Trump, okay? Now, I'm making this decision obviously very calculated. Don't tell me that I'm being biased. I'm telling you the reason why. In the lead up to the 2020 election, the polls overestimated Vice President Biden. They overestimated him, and it ended up going for him, but by only 0.6%. Now they're tied, and I don't really see a path whatsoever. Okay, so that is for that particular state. We're gonna go ahead and give it to former President Trump. Okay, former President Trump, the state of Wisconsin. Now, again, guys, you guys could disagree with me with regards to Pennsylvania. I know a lot of people are gonna disagree with me with Pennsylvania. Now, again, this is based off of polling data, so do not get mad at me. This is almost entirely strictly based off of polling data. We could talk about the state of Wisconsin. Again, guys, put your suggestions about the state of Wisconsin or other districts as well. You could talk to me about that as well. Make sure you put that as well. But obviously, just a quick preview. Obviously, just a quick preview here. We saw obviously the New Hampshire primary took place recently, and I believe that I have. Sorry, let me go back there. All right, give me a few seconds, guys. All right, so let me go back. All right, sorry about that. So we saw the New Hampshire primary. We saw that President Trump ended up winning by around 11 points or so. That was an open primary, and then we saw that President Biden actually ended up winning by a larger margin over his nearest competitor, Dean Phillips. Now, what does that show? Well, it shows that the DNC, the Democratic Party, is trying to unify itself around President Biden. Now, that being said, he only ended up winning around 64% of the vote. And Dean Phillips, for his part, ended up winning almost 20% of the vote. Now, for an incumbent president, winning around 60% of the vote is not a big thing. I know a lot of people are trying to say, oh, the Democratic Party is very much tightening itself around Joe Biden. And when the results came out, I actually thought that by a very big stretch. Now, has the Democratic Party trying to unify itself around President Biden? Yes. Joe Biden was a write-in candidate. He got 63% of the vote. Yes. But is it the biggest deal on earth? No. Because Trump in 2020 won 80% of the vote. Now he was actually on the ballot. I will give Biden that. Trump was on the ballot, whereas Biden was not on the ballot. Biden was a write-in candidate. That being said, Trump ended up winning 80% of the vote in the 2020 primary in New Hampshire, although he ended up losing the general election. So just because you have your base with you doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the independents, other individuals are going to end up voting for you. Okay, we already saw that independents really like Nikki Haley in the New Hampshire primary, as indicated by the fact that Nikki Haley did a fairly good job. She ended up overperforming polls by around 8%. So it is definitely a scary scenario for President Trump, and it is definitely a good scenario for President Biden in the fact that he was a write-in candidate and ended up winning that much percent of the vote. And Dean Phillips, for his part, I mean, I'll give him credit for where credit is due. He ended up winning 19% of the vote. That's pretty good for someone trying to challenge a third-party candidate, for an incumbent president rather. And then Marianne Williamson got 4% of the vote, I believe. And then there were some other write-in candidates along with some other minor candidates as well. And then we had Ron DeSantis, Vivek, Chris Christie, Tim Scott. I believe Tim Scott maybe not, but you had some other candidates in the New Hampshire primary, obviously taking under 1% of the vote, but to no significance and to no avail. But anyways, guys, that was obviously a wrap up kind of there of where President Trump and President Biden stand in the lead up to the 2024 election. Now, guys, if you like this video, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button down below. It really helps out if you're able to do that. So subscribing definitely helps out. And this is the prediction as far as the polling data is concerned. President Biden 245, former President Trump 293, and that is the prediction for today. And I'll see you in the next video.